Rain lashed the windshield. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She hated driving at night, even more so in this storm. Bed and breakfasts? Never again. The thought sent shivers down her spine. That last one, with its dusty doilies and the unsettling portrait of the innkeeper's dead wife. Sarah shuddered. She had vowed to stick to motels, anonymous and bright. Places with no history, no lingering presence. Places where she could close her eyes and pretend she was safe and sound in her own bed. But tonight, fate, it seemed, had other plans. The radio crackled, the announcer's voice fading in and out. A severe storm warning. Road closures. Sarah groaned. This trip was turning into a disaster. The storm intensified, the wind howling like a banshee. Trees swayed violently, their branches clawing at the sky. A flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, revealing a fallen tree blocking her path. Sarah slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. She cursed, her breath catching in her throat. There was no way around it. Reaching for her phone, she realized with a sinking feeling that there was no signal. She was stranded. Another blinding flash of lightning, and she saw it. A sign barely visible through the driving rain. Pinewood Bed and Breakfast. 1 mile. Dread pooled in her stomach. It was her only option. With a sigh of resignation, Sarah turned the car towards the ominous glow of the sign. She had no choice. But as she drove, a cold, prickling sensation crawled up her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was driving towards something sinister. Pinewood Bed and Breakfast loomed before her, an imposing Victorian mansion silhouetted against the stormy sky. Even in the darkness, its faded grandeur was evident. Intricate gingerbread trim adorned the eaves, and a wide veranda, now barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint, wrapped around the first floor. The house seemed to sag under the weight of the storm and the years. The once bright paint was now a sickly gray, the windows dark and hollow like the eyes of a skull. The only sign of life was a faint, flickering light emanating from a window on the second floor. As Sarah pulled up the driveway, she couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The house seemed to exude an air of sadness, of secrets buried deep within its walls. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and stepped out into the storm. The door creaked open before Sarah could even raise her hand to knock. Standing in the doorway was a woman, her face half hidden in the shadows. She was tall and gaunt, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through Sarah. "You must be Sarah," the woman said, her voice a low, raspy whisper. "I've been expecting you." She ushered Sarah inside, her touch unexpectedly cold. The interior of the house was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something vaguely unpleasant that Sarah couldn't quite place. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and dust covered the antique furniture. "I'm Mrs. Blackwood," the woman said, her blue eyes glittering in the dim light. "Welcome to Pinewood." Her smile was thin and humorless, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. Section 5. A Peculiar Photograph. Mrs. Blackwood led Sarah up a creaky staircase, her footsteps silent on the threadbare carpet. The flickering light Sarah had seen from the road led them down a long, dark hallway to a room at the end. It was a large room, sparsely furnished but with a high ceiling and a large bay window that overlooked the front of the house, or would have, if it wasn't for the heavy velvet curtains that blocked out all light. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice echoing strangely in the empty room. "Dinner is served at 7, don't be late." And with another unsettling smile, she turned and glided out of the room, leaving Sarah alone. As Sarah unpacked her bag, her gaze fell on a photograph on the nightstand. It was a sepia-toned portrait of a young woman, her hair piled high on her head in the fashion of a bygone era. Her eyes, though, were what captivated Sarah. They were wide and staring, filled with an expression that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was fear. pure, unadulterated fear. Sarah quickly averted her gaze, but the image of the terrified woman lingered in her mind. Who was she? And what had she seen that had filled her with such terror? Section 6. The Whispering Walls. Dinner was a strained affair. Mrs. Blackwood sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her gaze flitting between Sarah and the empty chairs surrounding them. The only sounds were the clinking of silverware and the howling of the wind outside. "This house," Sarah ventured, attempting to break the uncomfortable silence. "It's beautiful. How long have you lived here?" Mrs. Blackwood's eyes flickered to Sarah, her gaze sharp. "A long time," she said, her voice low and flat. "A very long time." She wouldn't meet Sarah's gaze. The rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. Sarah felt a growing unease, a sense of being watched, scrutinized. The portraits lining the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow her every move, did little to ease her discomfort. As Sarah lay in bed later that night, unable to sleep, she could have sworn she heard whispers coming from the walls. Faint murmurs just on the edge of hearing. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened intently, but the only sound was the wind still howling outside her window. Section 7. A Midnight Encounter. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its sound echoing through the silent house. Sarah lay in bed, her eyes wide open, her nerves on edge. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the window pane sent a jolt of fear through her. She had to get out of this house. As she sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest, she saw it. A figure standing in the doorway of her room. It was the woman from the photograph. She was as still as death, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness, her eyes wide and staring, fixed on Sarah. Terror, raw and primal, emanated from her. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The grandfather clock chimed once, its sound muffled in the heavy air. Sarah was no longer paralyzed by fear. She was filled with a desperate need to escape. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. She threw open the door and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get out of that house. Down the creaking staircase, past the flickering candlelight, and into the darkness of the hallway. The front door. She had to get to the front door. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. A cold hand on her shoulder, a raspy voice whispering in her ear. "You can't leave," Mrs. Blackwood hissed, her voice filled with a chilling rage. "You're one of us now." Sarah wrenched free of Mrs. Blackwood's grasp and threw open the door, stumbling out into the storm. Rain lashed at her face, but she didn't care. She ran towards her car, her lungs burning, her legs screaming. As she fumbled with the car keys, she risked a glance back at the house. Mrs. Blackwood stood on the porch, her face contorted in a mask of fury, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. Sarah slammed the car door shut, started the engine, and roared away from the house, the tires spitting gravel. She didn't look back. She drove through the night, the rain a constant companion. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn pierced the darkness that she finally allowed herself to stop. She found a motel, a beacon of normalcy in a world suddenly turned upside down. As she sat on the edge of the motel bed, wrapped in a thin blanket, Sarah knew she couldn't just ignore what had happened. She had to understand. She needed answers. Days turned into weeks. Sarah returned to her life, but the memory of that night at Pinewood lingered, a dark shadow in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the sense of being watched. She tried to put it behind her, but the nightmares began. The woman in the photograph, her eyes wide with terror, haunted her dreams. The feeling of Mrs. Blackwood's cold hand on her shoulder, the sound of her raspy voice whispering threats, sent shivers down her spine. She scoured the internet, searching for any mention of Pinewood bed and breakfast, for any clue as to what had happened that night. She found nothing, It was as if the house and Mrs. Blackwood had simply vanished. But Sarah knew the truth. Pinewood was real, and whatever darkness lurked within its walls, it was still out there, watching, waiting. Sarah never forgot her night at Pinewood Bed and Breakfast. The terror she had felt, the chilling encounter with the woman in the photograph, and Mrs. Blackwood's menacing presence all remained seared into her memory. She never again stayed in a bed and breakfast, opting instead for the sterile anonymity of motel rooms. The antique doilies and the portraits of long-dead relatives held no appeal for her. She had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back, and sometimes in the dead of night, she could have sworn she heard a whisper, carried on the wind, a chilling reminder of the darkness that awaited her at Pinewood, a place she knew she could never, and would never, return to.